This is my open letter to Soka University of America, SUA, and Soka Gakkai International USA, or SGI-USA. This is the third draft, written July 17th to July 30th, 2025. Dear Soka University alumni, students, faculty, and staff, and Soka Gakkai USA leaders and members, I have wanted to write this letter sooner, but due to tragic events which has happened at my alma mater, I feel I can wait no longer in addressing this important issue. In Daisaku Ikeda's dialogue with futurist Hazel Henderson, he writes, or he says, though most religious traditions stipulate a prohibition against lying, Buddhism, quote, Buddhism goes one step further than forbidding lying by requiring us to speak the truth, end quote. That's from page 40 of the dialogue with Hazel Henderson. I hope the truths I write in this letter don't grate too harshly at the ears. I have been a very strong and consistent member of the SGI-USA since about 1980, when I graduated from the Junior Pioneers, now called the Future Division, and joined the brass band. I also attended SUA, or Soka University of America, from 2001 to 2005, and graduated with honors from the first graduating class of 2005. I have read more books from Daisaku Ikeda than any other author, though I've been a very avid reader of many other subjects since my teenage years. What I have admired most about Daisaku Ikeda's books, dialogues, and lectures is his consistency in pointing out the great dangers in authoritarianism and the danger and folly of following those who claim to be authorities. In 2020, when SUA and SGI-USA decided to blindly go along with the false narratives of unelected and corrupt so-called health bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and known criminals in Davos, in their extremely totalitarian and unconstitutional mandates to stop law-abiding people from peacefully assembling, which is our First Amendment right, our First Amendment constitutional right, I was extremely disheartened. Despite President Ikeda's lifelong promotion of dialogue, the leaders of SGI-USA and administrators of SUA decided to blindly go along with these extremely draconian and very unconstitutional mandates. This all without any dialogue with SGI-USA frontline leaders or with SUA alumni. But instead, SGI-USA shuttered indefinitely all community centers and banned all members from gathering in person for Buddhist activities. In addition, SUA closed its campus and moved classes to online classes. At the time, I was a district men's division leader in San Diego, and until then, we had very dynamic meetings about 3 times a month in my apartment in Normal Heights. Living alone as I did at the time, I looked forward 3 times a month to having a reason to clean my apartment and have sometimes up to 30 people joyously gathering to study and practice Buddhism and have dialogues about the practice and our lives. The mystical thing about my apartment at the time was when a young lady from the property management group was giving me a tour of it before I decided to move in, she made a compliment about my necklace. However, it wasn't really a necklace. It was my Juzu beads, which I purposely wore around my neck so I would be reminded to introduce people to Buddhism. Invariably, many people would ask about my necklace, as this young lady did. So I would have reason to say, as I did to this young lady, "These are my Juzu beads. I use them to chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo." To this, the young lady giving me the tour of my apartment, apartment 7, like the 7 characters of the Daimoku, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, she said, "Wow, the former lady who rented this apartment used to have Buddhist gatherings here. Therefore, the previous home of SGI-USA North Park District once again became the home of North Park District meetings." In the 80s, during my teenage years, after reading 3 published dialogues Daisaku Ikeda had with Arnold Toynbee called "Man Himself Must Choose," later retitled "Choose Life," and the second dialogue with Aurelio Pesci, the founder of Club of Rome, called "Before It's Too Late," and the third dialogue with Renee Huguet, "Dawn After Dark," I had this awakening in about 1989, my senior year in high school, that everything being presented on the so-called news was actually complete lies and propaganda. Therefore, I completely stopped watching TV and started reading books ravenously to learn about world issues and how to solve them. Therefore, when the so-called pandemic hit, I knew that if both the so-called left media and the so-called right media and both wings of the corporate duopoly in Washington were all in lockstep promoting the very counterproductive and extremely unhealthy countermeasures, that I knew it was a psyops, or a psychological operation. After knowing for over 30 years that these same media outlets and criminal politicians had lied repeatedly about the wars in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere, that they had covered up the Franklin scandal and the opium epidemic and what pizza and hot dogs really meant in certain emails, I knew I could never take anything these shills ever reported on. Did the administrators at SUA and the leaders of SGI-USA believe that all of a sudden these corrupt news outlets and bought-off politicians for once in reality somehow cared about the average person's health and safety? If any of them bothered to read any of my books that I wrote and published and donated to the SUA library, which they never put into circulation, they would not have been fooled by this fully rehearsed and orchestrated misanthropic COVID coup. Even before the lockdowns, I knew full well when they started taking down all my health videos that I have had on my YouTube channel for over 10 years before the scamdemic, that this was a gigantic worldwide psychological operations, or psyops, that had nothing to do with the lab-created virus called SARS-CoV-2. I didn't buy into any of the fear porn that SGI-USA leaders were using to shut down the whole Kozen-Rufu movement and SUA was using to stifle Soka education. How many worse diseases were ravaging Japan in the Daishonin's time, and never once in any of his thousands of writings did he ever say, "You should lock yourself indoors and stop going out in public and let the rich monopolists destroy your businesses while they profited hand over fist." How could any Buddhist discourage the community of believers from communing together, which is the third of the 3 treasures? The worst part about this tragedy is the SGI-USA leadership did this unconscionable and unconstitutional act without any consultation with district leaders, who I've been told by President Ikeda for over 4 decades, are the most important leaders in the organization. Instead, some pencil pushers in LA or elsewhere just decided to close down the whole organization. So much for dialogue. So for this whole 2+ years of shutdown, I decided instead to turn North Park District home into the live studios of a new podcast called Live from Normal Heights. At least once or twice a month, I had anywhere from 2 to 20 people meet in my former district home to discuss the pandemic and all of its crimes and injustices, and what people were doing personally to counter it. I worked 7 days a week throughout the whole pandemic, delivering groceries for Whole Foods and Amazon Fresh Groceries. On my deliveries, I ran into so many active young people and old people who were all defying the unconstitutional house arrest orders. These singers, songwriters, activists, rappers, actors, directors, painters, and other artists were out among the community, not following any of the nonsense of the high priest of pharmacology, the known criminal Anthony Fauci. We did our podcast live on Facebook and Instagram, and then uploaded them to YouTube. Eventually, I was kicked off of Instagram and Facebook with absolutely no explanation or chance for... I'm sorry, my writing is bad. Or chance for review on September 19th, 2021. But all 30+ episodes can still be seen on my YouTube channel and my Rumble channels. This was truly the standalone spirit that my mentor, Daisaku Ikeda, has taught me all my life. And of course, none of the over 100 people who came to my apartment ever got sick from coming to the podcast unmasked and without any social distancing nonsense. If I would have been able to continue having SGI district meetings during this time, I'm sure the same thing would have happened. As the current HHS Secretary, Human Health Services Secretary says, quote, "The framers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights purposely put no exemption for pandemics, as they had far worse and more deadly outbreaks of disease in their time than the overhyped COVID scare," end quote. I reached out to all the youths of San Diego who were immune to all the COVID disinformation and misinformation pushed by the brought to you by Pfizer corporate media shills who claimed to be bringing people the news, which was nothing but fear porn to push policies of human control which had absolutely nothing to do with public health or safety. I would often write on my Facebook page during the whole pandemic, the whole human fabricated fiasco that I rightly called a scamdemic and a plandemic. I would write, quote, "Faith is to fear nothing, to stand unswayed, the power to surmount any obstacle. Faith is the source of all solutions, the mighty ship needed to cross the sea of sufferings." This is from Daisaku Ikeda's poem to my young American friends that he gave us in the U.S. in the 70s when I was in Junior Pioneers. Nowhere in that amazing poem did President Ikeda say, "Fear nothing but a laboratory-created virus, and stay locked in your homes, and stop doing Kozen Rufu until the talking heads on TV tell you it's safe to go out and live your life again. I was able to introduce more people to my Buddhist practice than all the members who were blindly following these unconstitutional mandates to stay on house arrest. President Ikeda wrote, quote, "Quite simply, there can be no true democracy unless the citizens of a country realize that they are sovereign, that they are the main protagonists, and then, with wisdom and a strong sense of responsibility, take action based on that realization. Democracy cannot be successful in its mission unless the people rouse themselves to become more informed and involved, unless they unite, unless they establish an unshakable force for justice and keep a strict eye on the activities of the powerful." End quote. That's from April 13th, from Today and Tomorrow Daily Encouragements. So who were the quote-unquote powerful that President Ikeda speaks of in this guidance during the COVID coup? The High Priest of Scientism, Anthony Fauci, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. so eloquently details in his best-selling book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health, which I read entirely on my Facebook page, and you can still find it. I uploaded a lot of that to my YouTube and my Rumble pages. He has had a long, deadly career of abuse of science and medicine to line him and his minions' pockets at the expense of hundreds of thousands of humans and animals' lives. Just during the laboratory-created AIDS/HIV pandemic alone, Mr. Fauci killed more people than any other doctor in history, including Shido Ishii and Joseph Mengele. Bill Gates, who profited more from his BioNTech stock during the COVID coup than any other individual, who many aware people call Kill Gates, due to the incredible increase in deaths everywhere he goes with his deadly quote-unquote vaccine schemes. In one Danish study, they showed that he killed 4 people for every person he supposedly saved in Africa. Is there no wonder that he started the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health? So what does Mr. Gates want to do to the population? He has stated publicly, and it can be seen on YouTube and elsewhere, that with his vaccine programs, quote, if he does a good job, he hopes to reduce the world population by 10 to 15%. In the Danish study on Bill Gates' African vaccine scheme, he was using a vaccine which had already been pulled from the markets for its extreme unsafeness in all developed nations. But for incredible profits, Bill Gates pushed this deadly product on so many African countries and fraudulently called his deadly vaccine scheme philanthropy. There is absolutely nothing philanthropic that Bill Gates, a known eugenicist, has ever done anywhere around the world, but he has paid millions of dollars to media outlets around the world to do fluff pieces that show him as a philanthropist, which is an absolute lie. He is definitely not a philanthropist. His humanicidal projects around the world show that he is actually a misanthropist or a hater of humans, of humanity. How could anyone who has been reading Daisaku Ikeda's guidance, or who is administering Soka University, or is a leader in the SGI-USA, not see through the, quote, activities of the powerful, end quote, as Daisaku Ikeda talks about in the aforementioned guidance, when it is so obvious if you've studied any of their crimes over the last at least 4 decades. There was absolutely nothing the U.S. government, nor its so-called health agencies, nor the World Health Organization, which if you watch the movie World Death Organization on Rumble, you will see their deadly history. Nothing they did during the whole 2+ years of the scamdemic that had anything to do with public health and or with human safety. Everything they did, as they had thoroughly rehearsed in their numerous pandemic simulations for the last couple decades, was to clamp down on human freedoms and supplant democracy with totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and increase in authoritarian controls and censorship of free speech, free movement, and bodily autonomy, and the destruction of people's lives and living, and the stealing of their property. How could anyone in the SGI-USA or at SUA be so blind to this? It is so blatantly obvious to anyone who wasn't listening to and or watching the trauma-based mind control that the my writing is very hard to read, even for me, because I crossed out things and wrote over things. How could anyone in the SGI or SUA be so blind to this? It was so blatantly obvious to anyone who wasn't listening to and or watching the trauma-based mind control that they tried to pass as news on the Brought to You by Pfizer media circus. During the first SARS so-called outbreak of 2003, I was studying at SUA, but I knew from reading the works of and listening to the lectures of famous whistleblower and best-selling author Dr. Leonard Horowitz that like AIDS, anthrax, and Ebola, SARS-1 was a biological weapon purposely released from a bioweapons laboratory, and the vaccine for SARS-1 was, like the so-called COVID vaccine, far more deadly than the disease itself. In his best-selling book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional, Dr. Horowitz details how AIDS, HIV, was created in a Bethesda, Maryland laboratory by Dr. Robert Gallo under contracts with Lytton Bionetics. This same doctor, who was credited falsely for quote-unquote discovering HIV, was actually the criminal who invented it and manufactured it. Dr. Horowitz also shows that Africans, African Americans, and gay people were purposely targeted with this new bioweapon, and even worse, Dr. Fauci used a known deadly quote-unquote medicine called AZT to kill the great majority of people who supposedly died of AIDS. This was the exact same strategy Dr. Fauci perfected during the AIDS epidemic to now use on all populations during the COVID coup. The faulty PCR tests that are known to give more false positives than true cases that they used with supposed AIDS victims were again used to create massive fear, which caused people to take deadly AZT, just like he pushed the deadly remdesivir during the COVID coup. To me, the greatest crime SGI members and people associated with my alma mater, SUA, should be concerned about concerning this whole pandemic is not only did SGI-USA and SUA go along with the fascist and unconstitutional mandates, but once the U.S. government shoddily tested and falsely licensed the deadly bioweapon falsely called a vaccine and pushed it on the public, the SGI-USA pushed it on all its members and their children, and SUA pushed it on all their students, faculty, and staff. They wanted us to blindly inject a very risky, experimental, quote-unquote, medicinal product into our volitional bodies, even people like me who already had natural immunity. I went out during the whole COVID coup to actively try to catch COVID because I knew, like with chickenpox and with the measles, that natural immunity is far more advantageous than destroying your immune system with some genetically engineered experimental medical procedure falsely called a vaccine. I knew with natural immunity that I would be protected for life. I saw through all the lies of the brought to you by Pfizer corporate media that people were dying in droves of COVID. They were only dying if they went to a hospital, which were massively financially incentivized to murder them with intubation and or remdesivir. In other words, they were murdered in hospitals to harvest their organs and increase government reimbursements by up to 5 times the money they would have received if they listed the real cause of deaths. Doctors and nurses started calling this deadly drug that Dr. Fauci was pushing hospitals to administer to anyone with a positive PCR test, even though he knew most were false positives. Just like with the AIDS epidemic. On top of this, everyone who went to a hospital for anything else, even if they had no symptoms of COVID, were repeatedly tested daily until they got a false positive test. The lie of asymptomatic carriers that Fauci used to murder people with AZT during the AIDS HIV scamdemic, he used once again during the COVID coup to murder people who didn't really have COVID with remdesivir. Since I studied diseases for many years before the COVID coup, I knew that all viruses, if naturally occurring, mutate over time to become less deadly. Therefore, I went out and purposely caught it during the so-called deadliest strain, the Delta wave, so I could cause the virus to mutate to a less deadly strain. Thanks to me and other courageous people who refused to stay on unconstitutional house arrest, we beat the laboratory-created virus. So for us who put an end to the COVID coup, that to think that now we would take part in a very dangerous medical experiment when we already survived the worst wave of the flu and therefore already had natural immunity was just absolute insanity. But the SGI leaders who were pushing this experimental medical procedure on all members and their children, and whomever at SUA was doing likewise, did not seem to know that they were not only illegally practicing medicine without a license, but were violating the Nuremberg Charter against medical experimentation on people without informed consent. For someone like me, who from age 20 to age, for someone like me who spent 4 years of my life from age 30 to age 35 studying human rights and humanitarian conventions at SUA, I was equally appalled that the campus of my alma mater was used during the COVID coup to medically experiment on up to 300,000 people, all without any informed consent. Therefore, I tried to have a dialogue with one of the lawyers at SUA. This person was one of my favorite leaders in the SGI when in 1989 I was the San Diego Regional Young Lions leader, and when I was YMD group leader after that, and YMD district leader after that, and YMD chapter leader after that, and YMD area leader, and eventually YMD vice regional leader before I attended Soka University in Orange County. This YMD leader, who came to visit me in the Compton Hospital when I flipped my car on the freeway coming back from a youth meeting at the World Culture Center in the 80s, was someone I always greatly looked up to. I recall many times in the 80s when I would be doing Soka group on a street corner far from a big NSA convention. That's a former name of the SGI-USA. It was NSA, Eastern Soka of America. Just in case some member got lost or couldn't find the performance site, he would say things to me like, being behind the scenes is far better than being in the limelight. This is where Sensei's true disciples are. To which I totally agree. It was because I respected this leader the most, and that he was now a lawyer for SUA, that I tried to have a dialogue with him about the legal ramifications of what SGI-USA and, more importantly, what SUA had done during the COVID coup. I told this lawyer and longtime friend that the medical experimentation that was conducted on about 300,000 people on SUA's campus was not only illegal, but they went against the Nuremberg Charter. But shockingly, he didn't want to listen to my concerns. The only real comment he made to me was, I never really cared for Trump, as if his Trump derangement syndrome had anything to do with the crimes committed at SUA, to which he was supposed to give sound legal advice to. For those who are not aware of the Nuremberg Convention Charter, to which the U.S. government and most other governments are a signatory to, nor the laws in the U.S. prohibiting medical experimentation to anyone without informed consent, let me detail it to you the way I tried to detail it to the SUA lawyer, who didn't at all seem to be concerned that both SGI-USA and SUA were violating international humanitarian conventions at a school which the founder, Daisaku Ikeda, had originally proposed to be called the University of Human Rights. He would be rolling in his grave if he had not been cremated. There are two main aspects to informed consent. First, you have to inform the human test subjects before you administer the experimental medical procedure on them of all the known or perceived risks and all the known or perceived benefits of the experimental medical procedure. Second, you can't allow anyone to take part in the medical experiment if they have been subjected to either A, undue influence, or B, undue coercion. There was only one product that the FDA had licensed for EUA, which is Emergency Use Authorization, and it was called Comirnaty. And it was never available in the U.S., so we never had a product in the U.S. that was actually available, because Comirnaty was never even available in the U.S. This product was listed as an NID, which is called New Investigational Drugs under legal law, which means every time it is administered, it is considered a medical experiment, which means it requires full informed consent. Therefore, before any doctor, nurse, or medical professional administers it, they need to give you a brochure listing all the supposed benefits and all the possible side effects. And they need to tell you verbally they need to tell you verbally all those things, and then they must have you sign a form that you are doing this medical experiment on your own volition and you haven't been subjected to any undue influence or any undue coercion. Undue influence is any positive incentive, like the SGI-USA saying, if you subject yourself to this medical experiment, we will now let you finally come to an in-person meeting. Or when some donut shop says, if you take this shot, we will give you a dozen donuts. We saw all kinds of food companies giving away meals and other things to incentivize people taking this very risky product. In every case, the persons who were administering this medical experiment were doing so unlawfully because they didn't ask anyone if they were being incentivized. Now let's talk about undue coercion. This is any negative incentive, such as SUA saying to students or prospective students, if they don't donate their bodies to mad scientists and take part in this dangerous medical experiment, they can no longer go to school at SUA, or if they are leaders, they could no longer, if they are teachers, they could no longer teach at SUA. All this made it illegal for anyone under U.S. law and under the Nuremberg Convention Charter to conduct these experiments. To make matters worse, the FDA tried to block Freedom of Information or FOIA requests for all the Pfizer trial documents that Pfizer submitted to the FDA for its initial EUA or emergency use authorization. They tried to hold these from the people for over 75 years. Therefore, until they finally lost the case, all the files were released. Before that, no medical professional was privy to all the incredible side effects of this very deadly product. So there was absolutely no way they could have given any participant in the medical experiment any informed consent, because that was being held from them by the FDA. To offer even more insult to injury, the criminal high priest of scientism, Anthony Fauci, went on the brought to you by Pfizer media and blatantly lied that this medical experiment was, quote, 100% safe and effective, end quote. And then the president of the U.S., President Biden, went on TV and repeated the same lie, 100% safe and effective. And then they had Rachel Mockingbird Maddow go on TV and repeat the lie for a third time. I knew that day that they were all lying because, quote unquote, effective is not a medical term. Let me take a drink. I knew that if they weren't lying, they would have used a medical term. And the only medical term that we have is efficacious. We only learned after U.S. court courts forced FDA to release all the trial documents that this new investigational drug, NID, had a 400% negative efficacy rate, which means, like Bill Gates's medical debaucheries in Africa, you had to kill 4 people in order to save one person's life. If anyone at SUA who administered this deadly bioweapon to almost 300,000 people were to give legal informed consent, they would have had to tell the victims of this tragic medical experiment that they would be 4 times more likely to die if they took the jab than if they just caught COVID naturally like I did. And the likelihood that any young student would die after naturally contracting COVID was less than 0.1%. They were more likely, excuse me, they were more likely to die of a coyote bite if they walked down the back of the mountain from SUA campus. But no one has ever freaked out and put up fences around the SUA campus to keep coyotes from biting students, because the prospect of such an incident is so extremely remote. On top of the COVID jab having a 400% negative efficacy, as the president of International Developed Markets of Pfizer admitted to the EU Parliament on October 10, 2022, sheepishly, "Oh no, we never tested the vaccine to see if it would stop transmission." Because, as she stupidly said, we were working, quote, "at the speed of science." As it turns out, most people I know who contracted COVID naturally like I did never got it again. But everyone I know who took the quote-unquote vaccine have contracted COVID numerous times since and have suffered so many other illnesses that they never had before in their life. This is why in the Nuremberg trial after World War II, the doctors who experimented on people without their informed consent were hung to death, and why all nations agreed to never do it again until, of course, all scientific rationality was thrown out the window during the COVID coup, where all laws and morality were all thrown out the door. And what were the known risks of taking part in this groupthink mass formation psychosis? If anyone bothered reading the Pfizer trial documents, which have now been published in 2 gigantic books by Dr. Naomi Wolf et al., sorry, I can barely read my writing. Oh, it's subtitled Pfizer's Crimes Against Humanity, the books. You will see that cancers have been skyrocketing in people who took part in this medical experiment. Miscarriages also drastically increased, along with a new phenomena of young people dying suddenly while playing sports, and a drastic increase in heart problems in previously healthy young men. Also, many young women are finding that they can't get pregnant anymore. I'm sure I'm not the only person who refused to be influenced or coerced into taking part in this dangerous, illegal, and immoral medical experiment. In fact, over 70,000 doctors, nurses, and medical professionals in New York City alone lost their jobs because they refused to be guinea pigs of their own industry. But unfortunately, many people were not as wise or as informed as I was. One of them, Lucas Colombo, SUA's class of 2027, who before attending SUA already had a heart condition, and it was well known that young men who have heart conditions should not take part in this dangerous medical experiment. He unfortunately passed away while attending SUA on April 25th of 2025. It was his unfortunate and tragic death that finally prompted me to take the time and have the courage to finally write this letter. I wish I wasn't the person writing this letter. I wish I wasn't the person that had to do this. I wish there was someone else courageous enough to do this for me, but unfortunately there isn't. Daisaku Ikeda often said and wrote that at times of crises, the true character of people will come to the surface, and you will be able to see who they really are. I personally had my district leadership taken away from me for daring to oppose the SGI-USA's draconian COVID policies publicly and for exposing their illegal activities in this regard on the internet. But I can only hope that the email I sent to the SGI-USA headquarters when the SGI-USA demanded that I upload my personal medical records to the SGI-USA app portal, that this letter caused them to quickly come to their senses and get rid of this illegal policy. I instead uploaded a picture of myself holding a sign that read, I have natural immunity and don't need any fake vaccines. Luckily, at one of my jobs, I was able to get a religious exemption, so I wasn't forced to take this very risky jab, which would have been illegal undue influence. The reason I was able to get a religious exemption was because I explained to this employer about both the Eightfold Path and the 5 aggregates in Buddhism. As I explained in my letter to my employer, the Eightfold Path includes right action, which includes volitional action. Because my daughter was injured by taking another vaccine that she was only required to take to study in the U.S., but wasn't required to take in Japan. Had I known about the extreme dangers of vaccines before the COVID coup, I would have never let her take it. My ignorance at the time caused my daughter a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering. I told my employer that Buddhism professes the sanctity of all life, and for me to harm life, mine or anyone else's, by making them take a dangerous substance and putting it into their body or someone else's body would go against the sanctity of life and would not be right action according to Buddhism. The 5 aggregates in Buddhism are form, sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. I explained to my employer that without volition, which means having voluntary action, I cannot be a conscious person, let alone a bodhisattva or a Buddha. I did volunteer to donate my body to science, but not until I die. How can anyone be a conscious person if they don't even have volition? When I just asked the AI on my phone what Daisaku Ikeda said about volition, this is one of the responses I got. Quote, Ikeda highlights volition as the link between perception and action, encompassing wills, wants, and desires. And, quote, he suggests that a fundamental revolution in the life of a single individual, fueled by volition, can foster the kind of consciousness and solidarity that liberates humanity from cycles of warfare and violence. It's sad when AI is becoming more conscious than the leaders of SGI-USA and SUA, who initiated the anti-human COVID policies. So when the SGI-USA started unduly influencing its members into taking part in this illegal and very dangerous medical experiment, I started a Facebook group called Soka Gakkai Members for Bodily Autonomy. Though Facebook shadow bans everything I post now and even more during the COVID coup, I was happy. I'm going to take off my jacket. I was happy that a few other SGI members were somehow able to find the group and join it. So we were finally able to have the dialogue that SGI USA leaders refused to have with its members and its frontline leaders. It was shortly after this that 3 men's division leaders came to home visit me to inform me that my district was being combined with another district and that I would no longer be a leader. In the home visit, they asked me to take down from Facebook the group I started called Soka Gakkai Members for Bodily Autonomy. My response was identical to Nichiren Daishonen's response in the Risho on Kokuran, when he says, if wise people are able to convince him that his points of views were wrong, he would gladly change his point of view. So far, no one has been willing to have a dialogue with me to change my point of view on this subject. So instead of taking down the site, I created another group on Facebook called Soka University Alumni and Students for Bodily Autonomy. However, after Lucas's tragic passing at SUA, the Alumni Association of SUA finally had a dialogue with me about this subject. In my dialogue with them, in my dialogue with a few members of the Alumni Association, I was able to surmise that Lucas was not given any medical exemption from taking part in this medical experiment, even though it was known that he already had a heart condition. However, he did not take a COVID vaccine directly at the behest of Soka University of America, because in 2021, when this experimental product was first introduced, he was not yet a student. However, he entered SUA in the fall of 2023, and by then, SUA had dropped its mandate requiring all students to be vaccinated. But when he was applying to SUA in 2022, SUA was still requiring students to get jabbed. In addition, it's safe to surmise that the Brazilian SGI, which he was a part of, was promoting this product to members just as the SGI USA was. Therefore, if Lucas was in any way coerced or influenced by either SUA or SGI Brazil to comply with this medical experiment, we would have to conclude, as harsh as it might sound, that both SUA and SGIU Brazil were partially responsible for Lucas's untimely murder. This flu called COVID had an over 99% survivability rate for young men like Lucas. He did not need to take this very risky vaccine, nor did any other student at SUA, who were all mandated to do so by SUA illegally. I think it is obvious now that both SGI-USA and SUA were wrong for expecting members and students, faculty, and staff to blatantly take this experimental product that has turned out to be so deadly and have so many side effects. According to the Pfizer's own documents, it has a negative 400% negative efficacy, meaning, as I said before, you have to kill 4 people in order to save one person's life with this so-called vaccine, which many medical professionals now rightly call a bioweapon. After this home visit that stripped me of my district leadership position and responsibilities, the SGI-USA finally started to have in-person meetings again. And I learned at the time from my previous women's co-district leader that not only did she now have cancer, but 7 other members of my chapter, of my SGI chapter, also had contracted cancer during this whole debacle. In all my 50-plus years in the SGI-USA, formerly called NSA, and the 13 years I practiced in Japan, where I was the I didn't write this here, but I should have said, when I practiced in Japan for 6 years, I was the prefectural English group leader in Sendai. So never have I ever been in one SGI chapter that had more than one person at a time, at any given time, that had cancer. I'm not sure if all 8 people who now had cancer in my chapter all donated their bodies to mad scientists and took this deadly medical experiment, or if it was only the SGI-USA's undue influence or coercion that prompted them to do so. But it is safe to say that the majority of them did so. So what can we do now to rectify this tragic situation? When are we going to have any open dialogue about this atrocity? If you have the guts to read the 2-volume book, the Pfizer trial documents, Pfizer's Crimes Against Humanity, edited by Rhodes Scholar and best-selling author Dr. Naomi Wolf, and also edited by Amy Kelly, where they had medical doctors, scientists, nurses, and medical trial analysts and researchers sift through the thousands of pages of documents that Pfizer submitted to the FDA to get the original approval to use this supposed vaccine for emergency use authorization, or EUA. The FDA fought a FOIA request, as I said before, to keep this from the public for 75 years. Fortunately, the FDA lost all the court battles and had to release all of them to the public. In these 2 very voluminous books, you will find across the board, sudden deaths have gone up. If you watch the documentary movie Died Suddenly, you will see that Lucas's death is not an anomaly. Even though Lucas had a pre-existing heart shortly after taking one of the mRNA/lipid nanoparticle/spike protein cocktails falsely called vaccines. Childbirth statistics in many countries have now shown a drastic decrease in childbirth after they introduced this deadly product. In addition, turbo cancers have been affecting young and old people alike. So many of the youth of SGI come from the members having kids. Many of them are students at SUA or were students at SUA over the last 20 years. Are we going to see a decline in the amount of youth in the SGI-USA along with the plummeting birth rates around the world? When are we going to have an accountability? Who in the SGI-USA were responsible for this deadly action of practicing medicine without a license? Did any of them know it was illegal to implore medical procedures without a medical license? When I discovered in 2021 that the SGI-USA was pushing this medical experiment on the members, I wrote on my Facebook page that this was far worse than when the Nichiren Shoshu priesthood required its members to enshrine the Shinto talisman in their homes during World War II. This talisman, the COVID jab, pushed by High Priest of the Cult of Pharmacology, Anthony Fauci, who needed a presidential pardon to shield him from all of his crimes, was far worse and more deadly and had far more consequences than someone enshrining some benign relic of some ancient religion. Shinto was a much more benign religion than the cult of scientism as pushed by the criminal high priest Anthony Fauci. Ever since the robber baron John D. Rockefeller bastardized all healing arts with his toxic petroleum chemical poisons falsely called medicines, the number 3 cause of death in the U.S. has become prescription drug use. And many people who have thoroughly researched this subject say the number 1 and number 2 causes of deaths in the U.S., which is heart disease and cancers, may be linked to many prescription drugs and or vaccines. I was very fortunate that in my 13 years in Japan, anytime I went to anytime I went to any doctor and he or she prescribed me any Western pharmaceutical product, I would always tell him or her, I don't take allopathic Western medicines. So he or she would have to grudgingly prescribe me the natural homeopathic, quote-unquote, alternative herbal Chinese medicine, which Japanese call kompo, that didn't give him or her a bonus kickback from the pharmacy. When I went to my 20-year SUA first class reunion last week, I wasn't surprised that at age 54, I looked as young or younger than most of my 2005 classmates. I even looked younger than some of the 2015 classmates, who were all in their late 30s or 40s. That was my class. The other class were in their late 20s maybe. Some of them were older. When I graduated in 2005, even though I was about 12 to 13 years older than most of my classmates, I looked the same age as they did. This is because since I was in my teens, in the 80s, I have always been into exercise, healthy diet, and natural homeopathic medicines. In addition, we were only required to take 2 or 3 vaccines in our entire life in the 70s when I was growing up. I have never in my life ever taken a flu shot either. The time is now for not only a dialogue about this tragic episode in SGI-USA's history and in SUA's history, but we must also have an educational program to teach all those who took part in this extremely dangerous medical experiment on how to get rid of the spike protein and the self-assembling lipid nanoparticles and the simian virus SV40, which is in the Pfizer jab, during the COVID coup, which have contributed to turbo cancers. We must also teach them all we know about how to repair their destroyed immune systems, so we don't have any more people die suddenly like Lucas. Across the U.S., I can't read my own writing, sorry. Oh yeah. Across the U.S., morticians and embalmers have been reporting an alarming new phenomenon never before witnessed that has only been seen since the COVID vaccines were introduced. They have seen long calamari-like growths in the veins of dead people, which now makes it impossible for the embalmers to inject embalming fluid into dead people's veins and arteries until they take out these long self-assembling nanoparticle growths in their veins and arteries that look like calamari. I wouldn't be surprised if what stopped Lucas's heart was one of these calamari-like white blood clots, not his pre-existing heart condition. All humans are prone to making mistakes, as I was prone to making a mistake with my daughter, which caused her to be vaccine injured. And if the leaders of SGI-USA and whomever at SUA was responsible for unduly coercing and unduly influencing people to take part in this deadly medical experiment, do not by now realize the extreme folly of their tragic mistake, and if they are not willing to now do all they can to rectify and make whole all those who were harmed, should they still be allowed to be leaders in our organization? Or should they be allowed to administer Soka University of America? A true sign of a leader, as Daisaku Ikeda has said for decades, is someone who can see when they have made a mistake and can quickly take corrective actions to rectify the mistake. There are many doctors and natural healers who have been working tirelessly to come up with natural products to try to chelate or expunge all the toxic substances that were contained in this experimental COVID mRNA lipid nanoparticle spike protein shot, including the SV40, simian virus 40, which was put illegally into the Pfizer jab, which they knew would increase cancer cases. In addition, the deadly spike protein has been able to cross the blood-brain barrier and get into every part of a person's body, including into their unborn fetus. This extremely toxic substance can be removed from victims' bodies with certain chelation products. However, time is of the essence. A group of people at both SUA and in the SGI-USA who don't have a conflict of interest should be assembled to study all possibilities of how to remedy all the harms that have been caused to SGI-USA members and members of the SUA community during this tragic COVID coup. We need to now implement an educational campaign to educate victims of SGI-USA and SUA's tragic COVID policies, and there is no time to waste in this endeavor. There are many smart graduates of SUA and other universities, and people that didn't go to college that like to research and know how to research, that can help in this endeavor. If we don't want to see more untimely deaths like Lucas Colombo Ferraris at SUA and in SGI-USA, and we don't want more skyrocketing cancer cases like the 8 people in my SGI-USA chapter in San Diego, we have to act now. If I can help out in any way in this endeavor, please don't hesitate to contact me. In closing, I would like to share one of the quotes I highlighted in the first volume of my 3-volume Selected Writings from Soka University, which was published by Second American Renaissance Press. This quote is from Daisaku Ikeda, from the published dialogue he had with futurist Hazel Henderson. Quote, he said, "Strong language that censures and combats a great evil often awakens adverse reaction from society, but this must not intimidate those who believe they are right. The lion is a lion because he roars." That's from page 40 of the dialogue. Sincerely, Timothy Van Kampen Janakis. Thank you guys so much for listening to this, and thank you for sharing it with other people. And please let me know if you can help in any way get this out to people, that we need to do whatever we can to remedy the tragic situation that has occurred in SGI and at SUA. Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to this. Goodbye.